Thank you for joining us. President Trump says he is optimistic for peace in Ukraine despite slim progress toward a ceasefire. The president says both sides need to come to the table to reach a deal, even as one of those sides, Russia, goes on the attack. Russia launched a series of deadly strikes at Ukraine's capital city overnight. President Trump responded with an urgent plea to Russian President Vladimir Putin on Truth Social. The president says both sides need to come to the table to reach a deal. The president saying in this Truth Social post, Vladimir, stop. He wrote, 5,000 soldiers a week are dying. Let's get the peace deal done. At the White House Thursday, President Trump hosted the Prime Minister of Norway, and he was asked in the Oval Office about the path toward peace.
I have no allegiance to anybody. I have allegiance to saving lives, and I want to save a lot of lives. We're putting a lot of pressure on Russia, and Russia knows that, and some people that are close to it know, or he wouldn't be talking right now. I think he wants to make a deal. We're going to find out very soon, but it takes two to tango, and you have to have Ukraine want to make a deal too, and they're being hit very hard, and I do believe they want to make a deal.
CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman joins us now. Willie, what do we hear from President Trump about how these talks are progressing and how long he's willing to act as a mediator?
Hey there, Lindsay. Good to be with you today. Well, President Trump is saying that he's optimistic about a potential deal between Ukraine and Russia, but he essentially isn't willing to wait forever. He talked about his own deadline, that he has his own deadline. He didn't give a timeline when he mentioned this earlier today, but he just essentially said that after that, meaning that deadline, we're going to have a very different attitude, the president says during his remarks at the White House earlier today. I'll also point out that the White House has been really clear about this when we heard Secretary of State Marco Rubio mention that he, along with other U.S. officials, aren't going to essentially fly across the world to help with this deal between Ukraine and Russia. We, of course, know that the president has been very vocal about his move towards peace, about bringing those two nations to peace. We saw that post earlier today with the president, as a bee just walks right next to me there. We saw that post earlier today with the president mentioning and blasting Russian President Vladimir Putin and telling him to stop, using his name specifically. I'll note that we really haven't seen the president use that type of language on social media. So the president being fierce in his pushback in terms of those attacks on Kyiv and saying that a deal has to happen and giving a deadline without giving the exact time limit for that deadline, Lindsay.
All right, let's turn to trade. What do the president and Norway's prime minister discuss when it comes to tariffs? And more broadly, where is the administration on trade talks with other countries?
Yeah, the president seems to be happy with Norway. He mentioned the surplus in trade that the U.S. has with that nation that is also a NATO ally, perhaps concerned about the situation between Russia and Ukraine, sharing a border, an extensive border with Russia. The president noted that they could potentially see a deal there. Remember, those reciprocal tariffs go on many nations, not just China. But China is really the key here. The president mentioning earlier today that those conversations remain ongoing, but Beijing has said that that's not the case, that we're not having discussions. We, of course, know that the rate for Chinese goods, 145%, includes those reciprocal tariffs as well. On top of that, you have other deals being made behind the scenes. We know via statements and statements both on paper and in front of cameras that the South Koreans are moving closely to a deal with the U.S. That could potentially have some news next week. We know that the Vietnamese are also making a deal and have had conversations, including conversations with the president. The president has mentioned that he's spoken with the Vietnamese leader there to come up with some type of deal. Of course, those two countries are really pivotal. A lot of goods move from Vietnam and South Korea here to the United States, Lindsay.
Finally, President Trump is asking the Supreme Court to let him enforce a ban on transgender people in the military. What can you tell us?
Yeah, remember the president reinstituted this ban that President Biden overturned. And what the administration is looking for here is saying to the Supreme Court that we would like to enforce this ban as the court process plays out. The administration believes that the court shouldn't stop a nationwide ban on President Trump's decision to not allow transgender individuals to serve in the military. So we'll have to wait and see in terms of what happens there. We still need to hear from those involved, the transgender military members in this case. But we'll have to wait and see what happens there as this case plays out at the Supreme Court, Lindsay.
Willie James Inman, beware of bees. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Let's turn to the situation in Ukraine after Russia's deadly attack on Kyiv. The Russian military hit the capital city overnight with a barrage of missiles and attack drones. At least 12 people were killed and about 90 more injured. Earlier, Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan spoke with Russia's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov. He claimed Russia only goes after Ukrainian military targets or civilian sites used by the military. They also discussed the likelihood of peace.
The president of the United States says he thinks the U.S. and Russia have a deal. Let's get it done. Does President Putin agree?
Well, the president of the United States believes, and I think rightly so, that we are moving in the right direction. The statement by the president mentions a deal, and we are ready to reach a deal, but there are still some specific points, elements of this deal which need to be fine-tuned.
Specific elements which need to be fine-tuned. CBS News senior national security correspondent Charlie D'Agata joins us. Charlie, can you put this latest attack for us into context, given the timing, the state of the battlefield, and Putin's calculus?
Yeah, Lindsay, simply put, this is the largest assault on the Capitol in nearly a year. That's a big deal, and it was clearly intentional. You have to look at the timing, and I think it's important to frame the scale of the attack because, people may have the impression that the Capitol is always being bombarded. I've been there when it's under bombardment, but Ukraine's Air Force said they tracked like 140 drones, 70 missiles, including at least 10 ballistic missiles fired from Russia, many aimed directly at the Capitol. And for whatever Lavrov was saying, this is a residential area that was hit. The aim was to overwhelm Ukraine's missile defense systems. So, it can be seen as a cynical statement attack. And it hit those residential areas, no military targets in sight. And again, as you said, it prompted President Trump to post on social media, Vladimir, calling him out personally, stop. It's not necessary. Very bad timing. But if anything, it's a testament to Ukraine's defenses that it wasn't worse. But it hasn't stalled talks. If anything, it maybe cranked up the urgency of trying to cut a deal. But this is really right out of Putin's playbook, showing the world and especially the people of Ukraine that he has the upper hand and weaken Ukraine's hand at the negotiating table. As for the battlefield, I mean, it's a grind. They've been pushing each other. There have been tremendous battles that have been taking place, but not much territory has been gained. The Ukrainians have all been pushed out of any area that they occupied in Russia, out of that Kursk region. So neither side making any real significant progress, but taking tremendous losses.
I mean, there were a lot of remarks in the Oval Office between President Trump and the Prime Minister of Norway today. How much daylight is between them and between Trump and European allies when it comes to Ukraine?
Yeah, well, Lindsay, it's also important to note that the NATO Secretary General was here at the Pentagon to meet with Secretary Hegseth before he headed over to the White House. And he made a brief statement that the U.S. and European allies are united in agreeing that Russia is a long-term threat. So there's no surprise there as far as NATO territory. Neither he nor Hegseth have provided any details about the discussion. We may get a statement soon. They do have two agendas, some of those shared. So both sides agree that NATO partners, European partners, have to do more to invest in their own defense systems, to give at least 2% of their own GDP, and they have to do more in order to provide defenses for Ukraine. So they have to pony up more money. But the Secretary General was also here to try to dissuade Secretary Hegseth and President Trump from putting together a deal that the Ukrainians would be forced to accept, which might see them handing over territory to Russia.
To that point, I do want to play some remarks that the president said in the Oval Office today.
What concessions has Russia offered up thus far to get to the point where you're closer to peace?
Stopping the war, stopping taking the whole country. Pretty big concession.
What did you make of that?
Well, first of all, the idea of stopping Russia from taking over all of Ukraine, even if it were possible, that would take years, and it'd be too costly even for President Putin. Otherwise, Russia would have defeated Ukraine long ago. And then how do you even begin to govern it? In terms of territorial gains, that is critical mass. Because at the moment, it looks like Ukraine will have to concede as much as 20% of the territory that it's lost under Russian occupation. That includes, critically, Crimea. Now, President Zelensky said that's a non-starter. He rejected that notion. That might not be a deal breaker from the United States perspective, because it may not be necessary, and President Trump has said this, that Zelensky recognizes Russia's annexation of Crimea, but that the United States would recognize Russia's claim of ownership.
Charlie D'Agata, thank you. You can watch more of Margaret Brennan's interview with Russia's foreign minister on Face the Nation this Sunday. It airs at 12:30 p.m. Eastern right here on CBS News 24/7.